Welcome back, grade 10s. So today we're going to talk about what happens when the cell cycle goes wrong. So we are going to actually learn how cancer cells form and why they can be dangerous for us. Okay, so remember, multicellular organisms are made up of all different kinds of cells and many cells. So these different cells are undergoing growth and they're dividing, going through the cell cycle, all at different rates. Nerve cells, once they're matured, so as an adult, your nerve cells aren't dividing. But intestine cells are dividing every 3 days. So there are cells that are more likely to be damaged that are going to have to be replaced more often, like those cells in your intestine. So there is a process called apoptosis where a cell that becomes injured, where it can't be repaired, if it can't pass through a checkpoint in the cell cycle or things like that, then that cell is going to become unhealthy for the whole organism. So for a multicellular organism, it's really important that those cells that are damaged and things like that die off, so it can keep the whole organism healthy. And so this regulation and controlled cell death is called apoptosis. But a cell that isn't being regulated and is just passing through the cell cycle and dividing uncontrollably is called a cancer cell. Okay, so a cancer cell will develop if there is a change in the DNA that affects how that cell is going to divide. So anytime a cell's DNA is changed, good, bad, or indifferent, it's called a mutation. And so if there is a mutation in how that cell how its DNA controls cell division, if there's a change in there, then the cell can start to divide uncontrollably. So what we find is a cancer cell is going to divide very differently from a normal cell. So normally there are kind of signals for a cell that it will follow for it to stop dividing. But cancer cells ignore those signals. One of them is density dependence. So normal cells, after they've made contact with other cells, are going to stop dividing. But cancer cells ignore that. So they, even though they come into contact with other cells, they'll still keep dividing and multiplying, and they'll just pile up until there's no more nutrients. And we call that a tumor. Okay, so that mass of cancer cells that's dividing and dividing. And as that tumor gets bigger and bigger, its nutrients are becoming exhausted, right? It needs more nutrients, it needs more oxygen. So what it does is those tumors, the tumor cells, start to release proteins, and they attract new blood vessels to form around them so that they can have a better supply of oxygen and nutrients. And this growth of new blood vessels for a tumor is called angiogenesis. Now there's two types of tumors. So benign tumors are not really considered cancerous. They're an unusual growth, but the tumor cells tend to stay together. They don't really have any serious effects on any surrounding tissue. Okay, so it's not necessarily a good thing, but it isn't cancer yet. Malignant tumors, on the other hand, are masses of cells that are growing and they're interfering with the surrounding tissue. The other cells and tissues can't do their job properly because these tumor cells are getting in the way. So malignant tumors are considered cancerous. So malignant tumors are the ones that can undergo metastasis or spreading around the body. So remember, angiogenesis is that production of new blood vessels around a tumor. So again, it's giving that tumor food and oxygen supply. But it's also a way for those tumor cells to break off and escape to another part of the body. So when a cell breaks away from the tumor and travels through the blood to another tissue, we call that metastasis. And that's really dangerous because what can happen is those cancer cells spread around and they start new tumors in different areas of the body. And so this would be how cancer would spread. So this is just kind of a diagram to show that. So here we have our primary tumor, so all these cells piling on top of each other, and we've had angiogenesis forming, so there's blood vessels inside the tumor there. And what happens is these cells can then start to break off and travel through the blood. And this is called metastasis. So once the cells start moving away from that primary first tumor and start to invade other parts of the body. So cancer cells have some different features or different characteristics than normal or regular cells. Cancer cells are what we call kind of immortal. So normally cells are going to divide about 50 or 60 times, and then they're going to undergo apoptosis and they're going to die off. They've gotten too old, there's more potential for damage. Cancer cells, on the other hand, are going to keep dividing indefinitely. They are not going to stop dividing. They are not going to undergo apoptosis. As long as there is a nutrient and oxygen supply, they are going to keep on dividing. What we also find with cancer cells is because there have been so many changes or mutations in the DNA of cancer cells, they often will have many mutations and sometimes even unusual numbers of chromosomes, so not the regular number that they're supposed to have. So just kind of comparing normal cells and cancer cells. So again, those normal cells are going to divide through mitosis and cytokinesis, making exact copies of themselves. They'll reproduce about 50 or 60 times, and normal cells stick together, right? They form not masses of cells, but they form our tissues, right, and our organs. So they stick together when it's appropriate. And normal cells will also undergo apoptosis or self-destruct if they have outlived their usefulness or if they've become too damaged. So this diagram at the bottom is just kind of showing this is a normal cell, it's become damaged in some way, and so it's going to undergo apoptosis, die off, and keep the whole organism healthy. Cancer cells have some different features again. So they are also going to divide through mitosis, and in fact, cancer cells are going to spend most of their cell cycle in a division stage. So it's kind of reversed. Cancer cells will spend about 10% of their time in interphase and about 90% of their time dividing. So they're not going to stop reproducing. They are considered immortal. They're just going to keep dividing and dividing, even if there are signals that tell them not to. They don't stick together. So cancer cells don't really have any function. Again, they're spending most of their time dividing. So they're not sticking together at all. They're behaving independently of one another, and so they have the ability to move from one location of the body to another and set up other tumors. And again, they often have those unusual numbers of chromosomes or quite a few mutations. So this is just showing some of the irregularities that cancer cells may have. So there's kind of like an ABCD test if it's a tumor that is, say, on the skin that we can see quite easily. So what we're looking for is asymmetry, where it's different sizes on one side versus the other. If the borders are irregular, so it's not a defined shape, it's kind of, irregular. The color is not the same throughout. It's different colors on one side versus the other. And the diameter. So if it's getting larger and larger, then that means that it's something to worry about. Okay, so again, those unusual features, they have an abnormal cell surface, so they don't stick to each other. They break off and allow for metastasis. So what are some of the things that can cause cancer? Some cancers are, the risk for developing them is inherited, so it's genetic. It's not that you're definitely going to get that cancer, but you do carry a greater risk of developing some forms of cancer. Some examples are breast cancer, colon cancer, things like that. Other cancers can develop by exposure to environmental factors called carcinogens. So just some examples here, a radiation like X-rays or ultraviolet rays from the sun, certain viruses like HPV, tobacco smoke. There are lots of other examples as well, plastics and things like that. So why don't you think of how many carcinogens that you have heard of or that you know of. Okay, so thanks for listening. I'll see you next time.